Greetings. I'm here with Professor Jack Damon from Northwestern University. He came all the way to tell us about the CIA's coups in Latin America. Is that right?
That is correct.
I heard you took a course with Professor Frances Sullivan.
That is also correct.
She's an expert. She knows way more than I do, and I'm sure she knows more than you with her 10 degrees. But if you could tell me anything you know about CIA's involvement in Latin America, that'd be amazing.
Of course. Now, before going into the class, I knew a little bit about CIA's involvement in Guatemala, but I didn't know just how deep it went and how many countries were affected by it. Because before I get into it, I want to mention, did you know that 7 countries were affected by coups staged by the CIA in Latin America? 7.
I didn't know it was 7.
Yeah, the 2 I'm going to talk about today is Guatemala and Cuba, because that is the ones we focus the most on in class. Now, predating the CIA's revolution in Guatemala, there was a dictatorship run by Jorge Unico. He was a military general, and he was backed by the United States beforehand already. And partially because of that was because of the United Fruit Company. Do you know about the United Fruit Company?
I have heard about the United Fruit Company. They had land in Guatemala, is that correct?
Yes.
It was, if I am correct, between 6 and 1.5 million acres.
You are correct. The number is actually 1.5 million acres. Now, in Guatemala, 2% of the population owns 72% of land. And what happened was a democratically elected president named Mr. Arbenz decided that he wanted to redistribute that land. And what happened was he initiated policies in order to redistribute 1.5 million acres. We actually got something wrong. It was 3.5 million acres owned by the United Fruit Company, but President Arbenz distributed 1.5 million to 100,000 peasants, or at least that's what his goal was. And the United Fruit Company asked the CIA to intervene. And now, an important thing to note, I think.
Can I ask why the CIA asked them to intervene?
The United Fruit Company asked the CIA to intervene.
Can I ask why the United Fruit Company asked the CIA to intervene?
Because they were going to lose a lot of their land and they were going to lose a lot of money based off of taxes. And it is important to note that a year before the CIA was asked to intervene by United Fruit, there was actually an unclassified document describing President Arbenz's character, and none of it lined up with communism. They said his ideas were very American-made, and he was not communist affiliated at all. Or, well, not at all. They said that there were some people in government, but it wasn't a concern. It wasn't a threat. But as soon as the United Fruit Company was asked the CIA to intervene, they planned on staging a coup almost immediately. And so, but they placed a lot of the blame for the coup on the threat of communism. Mm-hmm.
Was Guatemala a communist country at the time? Thank you.
Guatemala was believed to be a communist country at the time because the CIA staged a lot of propaganda, which was a huge part of their coup, was misinformation, which is something that I was aware of before class. But what I wasn't aware of was how vague their plans beforehand were. In one of the unclassified documents, it went into detail, the stages of the plan, and nothing seemed to be like set in stone. It was always just political propaganda. And another thing that was evident, which I didn't realize going into the class, is that the CIA really did not care for what happened to Cuba after the revolution, because it was just a lot of vague nonsense in the sense that it was like, all right, U.S. intervenes, and then they place somebody backing with U.S. backing in power. They had nobody in line. No.
That's ridiculous.
No, it is very ridiculous. They did not say.
I also heard that their part of their plans were to fake propaganda around, including posters. They put posters up around with U.S. made propaganda that was supposed to look like Guatemala. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What about the pictures of gunmen? Was that true as well?
That was something we talked about in class as well, and that was actually something I brought up to the teacher, and she went in and elaborated more on it. What happened was there were certain groups that didn't like President Arbenz, and what the U.S. did is they gave them guns. And so they took about like a couple dozen people, gave them guns, took photos of them, and then showed the president and like people in power those photos, and managed to convince Arbenz that there were thousands of them. They also faked radio broadcasts by hiring voice actors in Miami and, making people believe that there was an actual armed threat in Guatemala.
Which there wasn't there?
Technically, there was, but it was all construed by the CIA to begin with. And this was all taught to me by Miss Sullivan, Professor Sullivan. Yes.
The greatest mind of our generation.
Absolutely. I agree. No glaze. And one thing I was also unaware of is that President Clinton apologized for the coup later on. So, like,
That was in 1999, right?
yes, good. Wow, I didn't even remember that date. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So after they staged the coup, immediately after they placed in a dictatorship, and 200,000 people were killed in a dirty war. And one important thing that I didn't know about was the Mayan women who would protest because the dictator at the time would take away the children of all these people, of all these student protesters, and they would kill them. And I didn't know, it was something that I didn't know of going into the class, and something I learned about is the Mayan woman would protest, and it gained a lot of traction across the entire world.
And you mentioned a dirty war. Did the Mayan women fight in that war as well?
Well, so the dirty war was actually the tactics used to it was describing the tactics used by the government, in the sense that, like, they would, instead of publicly eliminate opposition, they would just kill them, and they would take them, torture them, and kill them in secret, so that it was like ultimate censorship and nobody knew what was going on. But the Mayan women were the ones that were bringing that to light, saying there are disappearances, and it let people from all across the world know that people are disappearing instead of it going out silent. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's heavy. There's a lot to talk about there. No, of course, of course. He brought extensive notes. It's about 300 pages there, but I'm sure we can't get through all of it tonight. Um, can we move on to Cuba?
Yes, I would like that very much.
So, of course, I don't know much about this. I know of Bay of Pigs. I know what happened there. If there's any other information, any other details you want to give me about that, or even another topic we could get into.
Now, so Bay of Pigs is generally known by the public, but one thing that was good about class is that I was able to learn about stuff predating Bay of Pigs and, like, U.S.-Cuban relations. So between 1899 and 1902, U.S. Occupation of Cuba was taking place, and after 1902 to 1933, Cuba was a U.S. protectorate. Do you know what that means to be a protectorate?
That means when a country is under the help of the United States, and they're called a country, but they're sort of dependent on them.
Yes, so they are dependent on them. As a matter of fact, Cuba was the first U.S. protectorate, but it basically means that they are dependent on the U.S. They are their own state, but the U.S. can step in at any time to oversee things, to, basically take charge and tell lawmakers what to do. So it was already a little bit shaky in Cuba, because it seemed that the leaders kind of let the U.S. do whatever they needed to. Let's see. Oh, and what was it? The Good Neighbor policy around the 1930s, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to improve relations with Latin America, prioritizing cooperation. But one thing that Professor Sullivan made clear for us to know is I believe that not all of the like obviously the good relations policy did not work. We did not have good relations with Cuba, but I do remember them saying many, many times that the states needed to act accordingly in order for them to have a good relations. And what acting accordingly meant was pretty much letting U.S. investors and U.S. Businesses enter Cuba, enter Guatemala, enter all these states, and allow business to take over. And a lot of what happened with those businesses, evident in Cuba, they owned 72% of land. What would happen is they would, go in, basically create an entire town so that the entire population was reliant on them, and then pay them no money, because if they wanted more pay, they would get fired and they'd hire even poor people for less money, which is not something I was aware of. Just how much the U.S. economy was taking over these countries, which is something that
they had a grip on them. And this, of course, didn't work out and couldn't last, as there's a big embargo between them now, right?
Well, yes, but that's going forward. But so I'm gonna scroll through my notes real quick. Sorry, I'm so close. So in 1952 to 1956, there was a dictatorship backed in the U.S. The dictator was Fulgencio Batista, and what ended up happening is Fidel Castro started leading a movement. He started leading attacks against the dictatorships, and one unsuccessful one, let me find it right here. Oh, Mondanka. Is that how it's called? Moncada. It fails, and Fidel Castro fled into Mexico, where he met an Argentinian doctor called Che Guevara. And those two worked together greatly because Che Guevara was a doctor, and when they settled back into to Cuba, every town they would go to poor towns, take them over, but they would immediately start giving aid to the peasants. So they were gathering a following. So this yes, this revolution, it was a revolution. It was armed guerrilla revolution. It started gaining backing almost immediately, which I wasn't aware of this, because Professor Sullivan made it abundantly clear that it is important to understand why the country, supported a revolution. I didn't understand why, and it seemed that at first the revolution was a good thing because they were going into towns, they were giving them aid, they were building homes, and they were educating people. But so the revolution gained so much backing that in 1959, Fidel took power. And yeah, again, in the first 9 months of the revolution, he did many great things for the country. He, labor wages were raised, legally abolished racial discrimination, private resorts were open to the public, and an education movement. So a majority of Cuba at the time could not read and they could not write. And what they were doing at the time was having these young female students come in and educate a bunch of the people, teach the townsfolk. And what they were teaching them was also propaganda. So they were being taught stories of Fidel and Che Guevara, so that they were learning more about the revolution and more about why it was successful, why it's good for its people. And
so they were spreading communism around, helping and spreading communism out.
Yes, that you're right. They were helping people, but they were spreading their message because Fidel was very clear that it was a communist revolution. Now, the reason, so step in come the CIA. The CIA tried using Operation PB Success, one of the main sources, or a primary source for the Guatemalan Revolution. They tried using that exact same operation tactics on Cuba, Bay of Pigs, and it does not work. Do you know why it does not work?
I don't.
Because of all the things I just said to you, and because of all the things Professor Sullivan taught us, is because people were really in support of Fidel. He was a spokesman. He was loved by the people. And they could not spread misinformation because everyone already knew everything they wanted about Mr. Castro, because they were learning about him. They were learning to write while learning about him. They were seeing all the good he was doing, all the people he was saving, all the good laws he was spreading. Like they loved him, and that's why Operation PB Success did not work, and it was something I was unaware of going into class.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. Thank you for coming in today.
Of course.
Really appreciate this talk. My eyes have definitely been opened.
Do you have any more questions? Actually, we still have more to talk about for Cuba, I see.
Oh, if we have more to
Yes.
talk about, I'd love to dig into this more. Yeah.
Tell me. So after the U.S. after the Bay of Pigs fails, the U.S. Puts an embargo on Cuba, and because of that, Cuba starts trading with the USSR, because obviously they are communist. And in comes the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets put missiles into Cuba facing directly at the U.S., and for a good solid few days.
That was because U.S. had missiles in Turkey too. Right?
Yes, that was something I didn't know of coming into class. The way they solved the U.S. missile crisis is the USSR removed the missiles from Cuba very, very publicly, but privately JFK removed missiles from Turkey, which I didn't know about that. That was something I was taught about. And the U.S. embargo is still active on Cuba. Like, we do not trade with Cuba. I was not aware of that. I definitely didn't know that. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's the most important stuff about Cuba talked about. One thing I did want to talk about before we end things off is that there are a lot of dates, a lot of names, a lot of specific historical events that we learned about in class, but I think the most important thing I can take from this class is that a lot of because for a very long time I knew that a lot of Latin American countries weren't in the best of shape, and were, I don't want to use the term lesser developed, but that's what I thought before going into class. But Professor Sullivan said something that was very important and stuck with me, is that U.S. policies directly affect, the economy in Latin America, and that's why they are like this, and that's why we have so many immigrants coming into the country from Latin American countries. And I feel like it's important for a lot of Americans to learn that, and I'm very glad I took this class because of it, because it's given me that consciousness.
Of course. From everything you're telling me, I would have loved to take this class. She seems like an amazing teacher. So thank you so much, Professor Jack Damon from Northwestern. Can you tell me a little bit about what's your middle name?
My middle name is Joseph.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.